I am resident of Collinwood for YouTube, Joel Sains, joined by my buddy Don Schmidt, my buddy Patrick McCray, my buddy Gordon Dymowski. We're here to pay tribute to the late, great Laura Parker, who passed away October 12th of this year. Um, Before we say any words, please join me and bow your head and for a moment of silence. Okay. All right. Patrick, Gordon, you guys have met Laura when she was alive. So, could you talk about your experiences, Gordon? You want to go
Well,
first?
I actually met her um, years ago when I was a budding Dark Shadows fan. I had attended two of the Dark Shadows conventions in LA, one in '91 and one in '95. And every time I met her, and I was surprised because when I first saw Angelique, I just I developed an instant crush. I mean, she's assertive, she's passionate and alive, and Laura was actually a very sweet, kind of very generous, very warm person. So it wasn't. It was kind of a shock, but it was a pleasant kind of a shock. Um, and so I didn't know her to say that I only met her those couple of times, but she just seemed very very genuine and going and reserved, but fun.
Patrick?
Is above all else, it was fantastic. I mean, I really have to assert that again and again. Um, and I have never met like her. Uh, um, she was a walking sort of yin yang of contradictions, but she was completely comfortable with them. Uh, she could be very sort of frank and funny and open minded, and then very much the flower of the old south. And uh, you know, could be um, he could be intensely focused. And he's unbelievable. I mean, I think she had a degree in theater, she had a degree in philosophy, I believe, and a degree in creative writing. So I mean, just I contend no cast of any show had the collective eye of the Dark Shadows cast, and Laura Parker plays you know uh, uh, part of that. So intensely intelligent, but then kind of daffy. And I think we both got lost trying to get out of a hotel, and we put Anthony Montgomery into it. So there's the guy who drove the Enterprise, um, uh, and that was wacky. Um, uh, intensely self-aware in terms of the quality of her output. I not her taking anything she did for granted. Uh, her, if a panel, because I got to kind of see and chaperone for I think, on Carolinas in 2014. And he could be very, very, very critical of the panel. If I say, oh, that went well. And that was horrible. And he was like, just had that kind of standard. And so I paid attention, and, the next one was. And not because of me, because of her. And she was just fantastic. I remember I had just finished a major Dark Shadows oriented writing project called the Comics Chronicles. And I, the delusion at the time, fascinated by anything having to do with Dark Shadows. And the fact is, just because you're on something doesn't mean it's something that you would necessarily. Not that she ever, voiced any antipathy towards it, but, I thought, well, I read this thing. I used the passive voice a lot. And I sat down and I was so nervous. And for one thing, I was stock still. And it's like I'm here with these new aunts who just want nothing but good for me. And we're just amidst this sea of deafening, awkward silences. And I said, oh, there's you're writing similar. How's it different? I was like a very nervous Will Ferrell character. And they talked about the differences in their writing. And I used the passive voice way too much. Like the nerdiest, weirdest, most insecure thing even I could come up with. And saying something. And Laura said, voice is good when you're writing in the soap opera, because things are happening. People watching them get out of it. That's a place where it's fine. I thought, well, in MFA and creative writing, and Laura Parker could. I'm okay. Well, I remember Catherine's writing style being very tight, very snappy, and his writing style is very lush. If you read any of those books, she's crazy about words and language. As I was developing kind of the daybook sound, that gave me permission a little bit to, enjoy language also, as much as I do. And she about, how her writing style would stack up. And man, when you can make Laura Parker feel okay about something, or maybe when Laura just, with her nervousness, makes you think she's okay, I don't know. But I said, you're very generous with your writing. The lushness of your language, it's very generous with readers. And that was a good answer. She really responded well with that. And especially in the fan field, I know a little bit from the daybook. She was encyclopedias full, but you get certain compliments, you get certain responses, but they're not always the compliments and responses that after a while. I mean, they're always nice, but and so I don't know how much critical feedback she was getting on writing, and that was a conversation. And then she asked me, so what do you direct at the high school? I said, oh, this, that, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? Well, I had forgotten that they were around and in their prime when, it's sort of that age to play the younger wife in that, when Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf came out, and they were horrified. And they got all these Atlanta people table, almost torches and pitchforks. Look at that at the high school. And they were just shocked. And Laura, and on this wonderfully maternal quality, and she came up on my arms and called Charlie's Island, which is like a theater thing about a guy in drag that had been done a million times back in the 50s and so on. And it's a little antique when it was brought up, but it was about the most touching thing I had ever heard, and I really need Shirley.
You were saying about antique. You cut out a bit there. Sorry about that.
Oh, and so that's when we stopped the virus. No, it was a very kind of antique play, and but it was a very earnest suggestion. It had been sort of done a lot in high school long ago, but it was so earnest on her part. She was very concerned for me. I had wandered down the dark path of Edward Albee, and leading high school students there, and by God, and it was so touching. It was so, I mean, my mother died in 2007, and so I had not had that like, that type of concern that was unbelievably sincere, vaguely out of touch. So certain modern teenagers' sensibilities were, but who cares? It was so unbelievably touching. Right. I for someone I thought I dealt with very little. I actually dealt with her a lot. I mean, I almost kind of sort of built a website for her. And there's some interesting stories about that. And I accidentally, this is great, how autocorrect did a horrible thing. And we were corresponding about an incipient website for me. And without me noticing, I swear, Your Honor, autocorrect put the most obscene, forward, sort of graphically, a series of text suggestions in the chat stream, and I didn't notice it. I swear to God, this was an accident. And I looked at the thing that I had sent, and I didn't send it. And I thought, oh my God, I sent it to her. And somehow she knew it was an accident. Somehow she had been down the road of the Messenger autocorrect. Well, and she thought it was very funny, and she called me, and she was laughing, and I really dodged the bullet with that one. Not a person I want to make mad, because if she's mad, she's also right.
Yeah. Don, what do you want to add?
Well, I really don't know what to say on this one because I never met her. So I don't have anything to add at this point.
I think when you look at the character she played, not just on Dark Shadows, because that's what we know her from, she did such a great job with her performance as Angelique, as Cassandra, 1841. I mean, really, really a great job. But one thing I really loved her in too, because I'm thinking, is she ever gonna? Because I didn't know she was in Kolchak until I had watched it. And when she was on and they were doing an episode of The Witch, I didn't want to point at Laura Parker and say, "Oh, of course it's Laura Parker playing the witch." I'm thinking, no, maybe they gave her some other. No, they gave her the witch. They gave her the role as the witch, and I'm like, oh wow! And it was so criminally good. It gives Angelique a run for its money a bit on that episode, and she does such a great job of intimidating Darren McGavin's Carl Kolchak in every way. And why not? This is the woman who had no problem intimidating characters on Dark Shadows. So she's intimidating Carl Kolchak. But I really, even though she's not into the ton, I really loved her as Bruce Banner's wife in The Incredible Hulk.
Well, what a tribute to her acting that is only, in it visually, and only in it for those first, couple of minutes. But if you go back and look at that sequence, he does an amazing range of things, and that's a tribute also to Kenneth Johnson, the writer. But see a relationship in full. And there is just, it's so cliche to say something magical, something so luminous about Laura Parker and marvelous, the reincarnated cat that that has a quality that I think so many other actors have, which is her ability to just, and the camera disappears, and she's right there with an audience member. Those eyes are looking right at you, and they're never thinking just. There's always, Freud said behind every wish is a fear, and behind every fear is a wish, and that sense of contradiction, that balance, potential contradiction, he just has. Indicates the camera loves her, and I remember when I saw her as Angelique, and then saw her as Cassandra. Really, just when I really started watching the show, and I never you like this in a great way. There was just something amazing, just in not only in the structure of her face. I mean, that's just gosh, but it is up here and in here, and my God, did Dan Curtis ever really just go into his office to a little altar and just think, that was in sort of this octagon of important Dark Shadows people, maybe the final piece that had to go in there to really create this amazing structure between Barnabas and Billy and Julia and Maggie / Josette and then Angelique. I don't know the talking. Yeah. We can at least play Catan with it.
Gordon, is there anything?
Yeah, she's done some also really interesting work. She's in a film with Walter Matthau called Save the Tiger.
Oh.
I mean, she's only in it for one scene, but she is really good. And I think a lot of what she brought to her acting, and especially with Dark Shadows, is that she is good at playing multiple she can play multiple feelings at once, and it never feels like acting, and she can just do it all in her face. I mean, she was actually hired. I think Dark Shadows was like her second audition after she moved to New York to pursue acting. And when you see the scene, and I don't remember the episode, but it's the first scene where it's basically Catherine is Josette and Barnabas is in. It's that first scene where Barnabas and he hugs Josette and he says, "Welcome to your new home," and the camera turns to Lara. It's not just, "Oh, I'm angry," or "Oh, I'm hurt." There's also a sense of, "Oh crap." There's a real sense of almost like she didn't want to see the truth in that moment. And I think that's one of the things that the other thing I've noticed with Lara Parker is the way she delivers dialogue. Regardless of the emotion, it's very precise.
Mm-hmm.
Like in Parallel Time, when she's confronting Alexis, the casket opens, she opens her eyes, and she says something, and Alexis is saying, "Oh, I must destroy you." Her response is, "Oh yes, one of us will be destroyed, but it won't be me. It will be you." And there's no anger or "wah ha ha, I'm evil" quality. It's very precise, very distinct, and it's and even with Angelique, you could see, you've got the 1795 Angelique, who's not just there's not only just the spurned side, side person, but there are hints of class, there are hints of resentment, there are hints of that this was more than just a one-time thing, that there's a more emotional component to it. There's the 68, the Cassandra period, where she's just, okay, yeah, I'm going to mess with Barnabas. There's the 1897 Angelique, who's kind of maybe the most mature, relatively speaking. Then you've got the Leviathan Angelique, who's kind of like, you know what, I don't want to get involved, just leave me alone. I've learned my lesson. Then there's Parallel Time Angelique and Alexis, but then there's 1840 Angelique. And I've always believed that if you took all of Dark Shadows, you take out the two parallel time storylines and you arrange it in chronological order. So you start with the trial of Judah Zachary and you go all the way up to the end of the 1840 storyline. You see a complete emotional arc for Angelique without meaning to. Because even though they were doing it piecemeal and reacting to whatever, there's an arc for her, just as there's an arc for Barnabas.
It says something really haunting and sad and wonderful, and it's very interesting that her arc kind of doubles back at the middle. And on one hand, because that's not necessarily the oldest Angelique in 1840, right? Because she doesn't know about the marriage to Roger and so on and so forth. But it somehow is the wiser in some way, because she's emotionally at a place where she can say, okay, you're curious, and that's it. And that used to always really depress me, because I used to think, oh my God, would the 1998 model of McCray have been better at dealing with this or this or this? And then I would remind myself that I am the 1840 model Angelique, and that made me very hopeful. Kind of abstract, but there we go.
Yeah. There's really great moments too, that with her being, I think the reason that her character is more mature in 1840, we're so fresh from, with her, in her mind, the character's mind, she's so fresh from 1790. She hasn't forgot 1795, things that have happened, things she's done, things Barnabas has done. They've both caused a lot of hurt, even just by that short of time. But she is willing to realize that when she's still in love with Barnabas, she'll always be in love with Barnabas. She tells him this in every timeline, and every time she sees it, I'll always love you, always be in love with you. And same thing here. That hasn't changed. It'll never change. And with this, she gets to the realization of, okay, I made a big mistake. I shouldn't have cursed you. But also, you shouldn't have shot me either. She doesn't say that, but we talk about, you talk about forgiveness, Patrick, and the Dark Shadows They Look. I think she realizes, okay, I'm going to forgive Barnabas by releasing the curse. And in turn, Barnabas is forgiving her, not just for releasing the curse, but realizing, okay, this woman has some sense of humanity inside her. And maybe I was too blind to see it the whole time. And I think that's what really 1840 delivers. Don, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, that's okay. Well, I'm going to just backtrack a little bit on what Patrick was saying earlier. Well, in my opinion, this was a person of many gifts. As Patrick has said before, the Dark Shadows cast was a kind of a Mensa convention. The woman starting off had a scholarship to Vassar. That's just the starting of it. But she was an incredible writer. And if you want to talk about that whole, like Gordon was saying, the complete arc, I think some of her best work, just in my humble opinion, was done in 1840 with what you were just saying, the forgiveness. And one of my favorite scenes or sequence was when they had out when she I can't think of the what's his name, she'd released the curse so he couldn't kill Barnabas in 1840, and there were some, Patrick, and you probably, well, you all remember, there were just some little scenes that she was doing with Jonathan Frid. Barnabas had come in for a walk and she was writing something. And he was so relaxed. Did you enjoy your walk? And he said, and what have you been up to? Like, they were almost this married couple, all these little things once she's released it and all the nuances. It was just, which crescendoed to her untimely death. But I think some of her best work was in 1840, and that's really been sticking with me today, was that work in 1840. Um, um, I'm going to jump around a little bit. I feel so fortunate, Patrick, and thank you for working on the gonna lose it, Christmas Carol, because my husband had left the house during that. He had a thing to go to, and I had my thing of Kleenex. This is one of my favorite Laura Parker moments. It wasn't actually on Dark Shadows, and they were going through the play, and I thought, God, she's got to be Belle, and she was Belle, and cue the music of Ode to Angelique, and I just lost it. Another little, I mean, she was like the perfect Belle and had that music going. And that was just another moment where she was so focused and so in control. And that was such a great Lara Parker moment. And I'll stop rambling, Jewel, but I've just been thinking about all these different things. I was thinking about hearing her interview after she did the whole acted out Angelique's descent, and she was being interviewed, and how she took on this project and she was researching this, and she really got into the inner soul of Angelique to do this phenomenal backstory. And it's like she acted, she's writing, she's in the head of their care. She took it to a whole nother level. And I just thank her for that gift. I mean, I could just, I'm still going to read the book, but hearing her act all those characters in Angelique's descent, almost all the characters, was totally impressive. And now I'm going through, started the Tony and Cassandra series on Big Finish, and her and Jerry Lacey had this chemistry.
Oh yeah.
Oh my God. It is just, you can't buy that. You can't make it up. You can't BS your way through. It just is. It's magic. And all those years later, they both pick up those characters like, like they went like it was 1971 again. So I've just had a lot of emotions today. The losing of Mark Goddard, and I remember, and we'll talk about it next week, I remember being a 4-year-old watching Antimatter Man, and here we are, which is one of the greatest. I mean, it was great, but these people of my it's really hard for me because it's this not so silent generation just disappearing, which was my parents' generation. So this has really been hard. I mean, Patrick, you knew her really well, so I'm sorry about the loss of your friend, but it's just this world that I grew up in that's just disappearing. I mean, that's the way of things, but it's still not easy. And those were two people. And Laura Parker, let me say this: seeing Dark Shadows as an adult, and I've said this before on your show, Jewel, I saw most of that rewatching it during the pandemic, and no matter how bad the day was, there was Laura Parker doing her thing. There was Jonathan Frid, so it got me through that period. So it's been a very emotional day. So I'll stop talking now. Sorry.
No, you're fine. You don't have to apologize.
Yeah, and I think the reason why it hit so hard is that not just as that previous generation, but the way that current generations relate to media is much different. then, like, I remember when I was a child, I think within 24 hours, Groucho Marx had passed and Elvis Presley had passed.
Oh,
And it was literally like within a day or so. And I remember thinking, like, I had grown up watching Marx Brothers movies on television, so I thought, yeah, that's a real loss. Elvis, it's like, yeah, who cares? I mean, it's and yeah, and I'm going to burn in hell for saying that, but it's, the way that older generations held on to movies, because that was their media of choice. And with movies, you either had to go, well, at the time I was a child, like, to watch the Marx Brothers, you had to, like, stay up until super late in order to see it. Not because they're dirty, but because it's like, that's what you only had 3 channels. What are you going to put on at 3 in the morning? But I think because we not only have a lot of television, but also a lot of access to it. We have Tubi and streaming. We also have, like, entire digital channels showing reruns of stuff, that it's basically just media companies saying, okay, we're going to show this because somebody's good. You've got DVDs and videos. We've got it so much that it's a much more immediate thing, because we can all go after this, go onto Amazon or whatever streaming service, find Dark Shadows and go, okay, watch Lara Parker, and be reminded of why we miss her. And I think that whole idea of that kind of classic TV, like the way that TV was made at one time, which is episodic, 22 episodes, each one is kind of a done in one. That's, I think, becoming a lost art. And I think now that I know Disney and I think Netflix have talked about maybe doing continuing series rather than limited series, even though it's kind of a step, even though, yes, it's their way to counter kind of the losses in subscribers, I think the way television used to be made is becoming a lost art.
Yeah. It's like
Gordon and Patrick, you'll know what I'm saying. I just saw Christopher Durang's play here locally, Vanya, Sonia, Masha, and Spike, which was written for Sigourney Weaver. They went to Yale together, whatever. And there's a whole great monologue in there. It's a kind of a late boomer angst about how we have lost that communal experience of a single media. And I'm on it. It's so different now. And everybody's just off in all these different directions, but you're not at the water cooler. Like, I remember when Roots premiered on ABC, that's all everybody was talking about for a week, because the whole country was watching it at the same time. So I that's a great point. I totally agree with you.
It's especially a crisis if there are certain genres that start to be omitted, because very quickly you get a generation that not only lacks certain cultural touchstones but certain sensibilities. I directed but something really became obvious, and that was that they were from the language and ritual of shtick. And I really knew, and I was concerned about this, and then I thought, and I said, what was the last major social event comedy that you remember coming out in theaters?
Mm.
They, that they were bereft. They didn't really know. They mentioned some things like, okay, I barked more before, kind of.
Oh, give me one second.
In some of the trappings of a comedy, and but really, it was an interesting choice. But when such an honestly angry polemic piece is what passes for comedy, there is Caddyshack. And so, this is also true for television. A couple of years ago, I was directing something, and every cultural reference I made sort of is like overalls. It was just totally ancient and And finally, I got that reaction when I made an Office reference. Even The Office was, with its intense saturation, was something unbelievable. Just, I know this has turned into a bunch of cranky old men talking about these kids nowadays, but it's, I have no, I feel kind of sorry that there is such a narrow cultural window, and that happens. We can have such an incredible saturation of media availability, and no program manager, no station manager, to sort of sift through things and say, you know what, I think this is going to be important for the next 6 months. Tuesdays at 3 or whatever. And Lincoln is now trying to get Lincoln.
Yeah, and I think now, going back to Lara Parker, I think now, because we're so media saturated, we would lose out on the reason why we're celebrating her is not just because she was an actress on a popular show. We're celebrating her because she was a great actress who melded into a really an excellent writer. I mean, I read Angelique's Descent, and it is, and I just started the Salem branch. And I think now for most shows, it's like, okay, you've got your leads, they go on to conventions, they do everything else, and they really are just kind of pursuing the next role after their big success. When you look at the cast of Dark Shadows, a lot of them have kind of gone through creative reinventions. Frid went from being a Shakespearean actor to a vampire to literally just adopting a new type of theater and doing his live readings and performances. Catherine Lee Scott became both a writer and a publisher. Lara became a writer. Jerry Lacey became a writer.
Clarice Blackburn became a writer.
Right.
Oh wow.
I'm trying to think of and I'm sure Patrick can name tons of others,
David
but it's
Selby became a writer.
And David Selby he's actually been a very consistent actor. I mean, I remember watching The Social Network, and it's like, oh, that's David Selby, because he's like the lawyer for the Winkleman twins. But most of the cast has continued to either stay creative, or if they've gone into something that's non-creative, it's been more of I'm sure you could find the thread of where that went into. You don't get that nowadays. What you get a lot of is you go from series to series to series. Or if you do decide to shift gears, it becomes more of a vanity project than a creative project.
Like, when I was growing up, like, there are like celebrity deaths that like affected like franchises and affected like the way I viewed a product. For example, like the first celebrity death that I felt for me as a fan affected a franchise was the death of Donald Pleasance and Halloween, how it affected the Halloween franchise. Because the next person to play that character was Malcolm McDowell. That wasn't for a while yet at that time, because he died in 95. But the most significant one prior to, would be the death of Owen Hart, and how he died. Dying, falling from the rafters, which was one of the most tragic accidents that happen in wrestling.
Yeah, and
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and it's it's I think right now, I think the other thing that a reason why I think a lot of celebrity deaths hit now, rather probably not as much for the previous generation, is that I think now we kind of see the value that they bring. And it's funny you've mentioned Owen Hart, because there's a clip going around of, and it's a clip from Bill Maher's show in the '90s where Bill Maher's talking about how wrestlers are all in the joke, and nothing's funny. They all know it's fake. And Roddy Piper starts to pull down his pants, points to his hip, and says, "Metal hip, broken wrist." And he says, "Hey, you know what? Owen Hart died. Why don't you go tell Mrs. Hart how funny this is?" And I mean, I swear, I think, and I think there's this attitude of, with celebrity deaths now, it's one of either three camps. It's the someone like Lara Parker who had a valued career, and we value that. It's the, of course that guy died because he's an idiot. I'll call it the Andy Dick death, even though he's still alive, or the cut down tragically young, and we have no idea why. Like your Paul Walker, and it still hurts, because I think what we're, especially now, because we're starting to lose that. I think that period of the 60s, that kind of 64 to like 70, 72, that's probably, I think that's the first great age of syndication, because a lot of those shows I remember watching on syndication. And I think that's a style of television that isn't as popular, and because it's so rich with memories, and it's the first transgenerational stuff. I mean, Dark Shadows, you had the kids who ran home from school. Patrick and I are kind of that second generation. Don is probably like third or fourth generation. Now that you have these multi-generational franchises, as people are passing away, people are realizing, like, yeah, there's value in this. We are losing people who help shape our cultural landscape. I mean, it's still, and I think it's also hard because it's, when you really think about it, Dark Shadows was on network TV, network daytime. Like a show like that, and I don't mean this as an insult. It's easy to think of it as this, okay, there's this stuff here, and it's streaming and you can watch it. But this was actually on a network with major support. And I think that's why, there's a lot of outpouring for her, just like when Jonathan Frid died, and I think that the documentary makes clear he was more than just Barnabas. Like, if he never became Barnabas Collins, Jonathan Frid would have still been worthy of a documentary because of his career. Yeah. And I think that what we forget in all these like celebrity tributes is that not only these people do work that we enjoy, they still did work, and they were willing to kind of pursue that creative spark, no matter where it led them. And I think that's something, that's a lesson that we should take from, I think, any old actors passing, but I think especially now with Lara Parker, because it's easy to say, oh, she was just on some 60s soap opera, who cares? But yeah, that was an important soap opera. She also did work after that, and you don't get to discount that, because she, you might consider it silly. But I do think, but what she brought to Dark Shadows was not silly. I mean, she, there's a reason why they kept her working off and on throughout the rest of the run. I mean, she's one of the last people standing in the 1841 parallel time storyline.
Yeah.
One of the great things about these performers becoming writers is that acting is ephemeral. Even a television broadcast is an echo of something. But writing is something that is eternal. It lives with us every time we open the page. And Stephen King calls it telepathy because we're able to with them, who they were and where they were. I had that dinner with her, the first dinner. With me about Salem Branch. She said, what was your favorite scene? Thank God I had one. And she said, oh, that was one of my favorite scenes too. And Jewel, I know you're fond of reading. Can I? Because this was something that she really liked. And I liked. And it's a Barnabas David from Salem Branch. And David has had his heart broken.
Sure.
That afternoon at Collinwood, Barnabas became aware of how much he missed David. Nothing afforded him more pleasure than the young man's company. He climbed the stairs and walked down the hall to David's room. The door was closed, and he knocked. But there being no answer, he turned the knob and walked inside. There was a blast. Surprised to see the boy sitting on his window ledge. Barnabas knew, from David's vantage point, he could see the vast lawn that arched to cliffs. Beyond lay the sea. David? The boy turned and revealed a face contorted in anguish. His features were drawn like those of a real man, and the flesh was puffy around his bloodshot. Mm-hmm. Oh, my dear boy, what is it? Barnabas said. David shook his head and turned again towards the sea. Barnabas stopped before he drew too close. Come, David, he said, down from there. David gripped both sides of the casement and looked down. Why? Why? Because you could fall and die before you. He hoped his tone was lighthearted, but he felt a wave of compassion. David had no one to turn to if he were in despair. His father was unsympathetic, his aunt out of touch, his poor brother gone, probably. Maybe I want to fall, said David. Barnabas suppressed the desire to laugh, but David leaned further out. The window was 30 feet above the ground. Barnabas remembered a silly tradition. Boys were given rooms in towers to make them more virile. David, come back inside and tell me what's troubling you. Still, the boy did not respond. Stealthily, Barnabas moved to where he took down the courtyard. David made a choking sound in his throat. Barnabas, he said, have you ever been in love? Mm-hmm. Yes. Love. Is that what has you so upset? The girl he was kissing in the woods, thought Barnabas in amazement. Was it so painful? Hot tears fell on Barnabas's hand, where it rested on the sill next to David's. Barnabas considered the question. It is that. Yes. I love her so much, and she told me she did too. Now she won't have anything to do with me. She won't even speak to me. David shuddered again and leaned forward, his body spread out. Barnabas glanced down, feeling dizzy, took hold of David's hand. That sounds serious, he said. Why did she change? Don't know. I'm sure it has nothing to do with you or anything you did. Where did you meet this girl? After a long sigh, David said in a whisper, the hit was the seduced to the phone. See, who it goes. I think Barnabas can identify. What a masculine, but sensitive and thoughtful, and just a moment that we always wanted for Barnabas and David, and never knew that we did.
Yeah. Yeah. It's been a really great tribute to talk about Laura Parker. Is there anything you guys want to add before we go?
good friend of mine, and I were in a situation a few years ago in Louisville. I lived in Knoxville, and we saw each other fairly frequently, but it was only at funerals.
Mm.
And our friends just went up where they were dying. And, I mentioned a lot of the bereavement therapy and stuff that I've and this one is uncomfortably well adjusted at times. And and at the last of these funerals, we shut up, we saw each other, and we just started laughing because it's like, and the laughter evaporated. And how do you do it? How am I supposed to keep doing it? And he said, I think about death. There's so much of it, and I could consume by what I've lost if I would let myself. Life is a process. I lost it the previous days. And he said, and if you focus on that, you'll be lost. However, I don't focus on that. You know what I focus on? 3 words. I was the statistical unlikely ever would have met this person. That Lara Parker asked him, Dan Curtis would have had a dream that Art Wallace would have developed it, would have turned into this thing. Jonathan Frid would have been hired to save him from cancellation. Lara Parker just shown up and auditioned, and they created this part, and it somehow blossomed into this amazing, full of spotlight importance. And that then we would see it, and it would resonate with something we needed in our lives at that right position to appreciate it. And yes, she's gone.
Yeah.
God, we were lucky. Imagine our lives if we had never encountered dark shadows or the character most important or and so we were lucky.
Yeah, for sure. Gentlemen, I want to thank you for joining me tonight, Dawn, Gordon, Patrick. This has been an interesting discussion about the late, great Lara Parker. Links to Gordon Dymowski's Amazon page is going to be in the description box. Links to Patrick McCray's Dark Shadows Day Book Compound is going to be in the description box. Gentlemen, you have a great and safe night. Take care.